Koka sunarai sunarayanti. 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 Koka sunarai sunarayanti.
Hello, hi, welcome to this new episode of the Mango TV podcast. Today we have my dear friend Rory Spowers. Rory Spowers is a writer, researcher and broadcaster focused on ecological and consciousness issues. His book includes Rising Tides, a critical acclaimed history of ecological thought, and A Year in Green Tea and Tuks, the story of Samakanda, an ecological sanctuary he founded in Sri Lanka in 2004. In 2012, Rory relocated to Ibiza in Spain to work with ex-BBC presenter Bruce Parry on the feature-length documentary film Tawai, which you can find on Mango TV, by the way, exploring humanity's conceptual separation from nature. He's currently the creative director of the Tyringham Initiative, a world-class think tank for new paradigm thinking, which he co-founded in 2015. And in 2018, he launched the Regeneration, a new media platform for regenerative systems change solutions. Rory is currently working on his next book, Thinking Like a Mountain, seeking the source code for a regenerative culture. Welcome, Rory.
Thank you, Giancarlo.
So Rory is a dear friend of mine, one of my teachers. He taught me so much about consciousness, about, this idea that psychedelic really makes consciousness primary. It's not an epiphenomenon from the brain. It's a primordial source that regulates everything. So today we're going to try something different on this podcast. We usually go through the biography of the speakers, and we're usually interested in the cathartic moment for transformation and regeneration. We're interested in how we're going to get to mass awakening. Mango TV has done this documentary on the Mayan calendar. We talk about the Hopi prophecy, the Kala Yuga, this moment in time as a moment of regeneration. But what we never really did is okay, let's assume that it's really happening. Let's assume that there is a mass awakening, that there is a critical mass of consciousness expansion. But then how would this new world look like? When you say, the new paradigm thinking, Rory is really a system theory. So today he's going to explain this. We're going to go through the chapters of his new book, Thinking Like a Mountain, and we're going to try to make some sense of this new paradigm. How did we got here? What is the problems? And what are the solutions? So let's get cracking.
Thank you, Giancarlo. So, the title Thinking Like a Mountain was a phrase coined by a man called Aldo Leopold, who was a conservationist and published a book called A Sound County Almanac, I think in 1946, but in the late 1940s. And is often credited as being the forefather or one of the forefathers of the American environmental movement. So this is before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and he famously wrote this book, and this phrase, thinking like a mountain, was really has become a kind of a sort of almost a sort of ecological term to denote or point towards this more systemic way of looking at the world, that once you study something in isolation from its context or divorce it from its context, it can take on very different qualities and characteristics. And I suppose this is well represented in this reductionist, materialist scientific paradigm, which has become the sort of the mainstream scientific view over the last 150 plus years. And what general systems theory or all these other terms that relate to it, like chaos and complexity theory, what they're all pointing to, I believe, is this much more ecological way of looking at the world, and that the way we understand how systems operate is by looking more at the interconnections and flows and reciprocities that occur between different elements within the system. So once we divorce a living organism from its context and start to study it in isolation, we can end up with some very different conclusions and assumptions, which if we reframe that embedded into the interconnections of the ecosystem, for example, we start to see very, very different things. So I think one of the great sort of insight, or one of the extraordinary things that's happened in the last few years, is this notion of a consensus reality that most of us subscribe to, at least to some degree, pre-2020, has been through a massive upheaval. And we can no longer make sense of the world looking through this kind of sort of rather unipolar one sort of lens. People talk a lot about a multipolar world at the moment, but what I'm suggesting in the book is that we need to develop a kind of multipolar lens to be able to understand the complexities and nuances of what is going on. And this phrase cognitive dissonance that's been really trotted out a lot in the last few years, I think what's behind a lot of that is we're looking at the same phenomena through different lenses, ignoring the fact that they are different lenses. And so you can look at the same thing through two different lenses, come to very different conclusions, but you're looking at the same phenomena. So what the book is trying to do is, in a very accessible way, is map out the way that we can start to deconstruct the complexities of what's going on around us through developing a more systemic way of looking at things. I hope that makes some sense.
That's a great synopsis. That's a great summary. But let's try to get into a little bit into the weeds of it, right? So I think you structure it in 3 chapters. So remind me the titles.
Well, at the moment, people talk a lot about this, what's called the Hegelian dialectic of problem, reaction, solution. So I've actually kind of structured the book around that, in the sense that the first part is going to try and give some context to this meta-crisis that's unfolding. Then the second or middle part of the book is really to try and deconstruct what I call a sort of ideological snowball that has been gathering momentum, arguably over thousands of years, but particularly in the last sort of 200 years, particularly, say, since the mid-19th century, with the work of Charles Darwin kicking off a sort of new understanding around evolution. But also then the whole sort of reductionist paradigm that has unfolded ever since.
And 3?
And then 3 is looking at the solutions. And
so sorry to be so. I would like to try to be a little bit organized for the audience to follow, because you're gonna go in some quite deep and complicated topic. So 1 is the context, 2 is the cause, and 3 is the solution.
Exactly.
Okay, let's take 15 minutes each. Look at the watch.
Yes. Yeah. No, I'm with you.
And let's start with the context.
Exactly. So, well, somebody said to me not so long ago, text without context is pretext. So if we look at it like that, if you think how you can remove some language from its embedded context and then give it a completely different slant, in the same way, if we remove an organism from the ecosystem, I think you can sort of see where that all goes. So the book opens really with a sort of an overview of what people are calling the meta-crisis. We look at things like the role of exponential technologies, this confluence of AI with nanotechnology and biotechnology, the existential risks associated with all of that. But also this notion of cognitive dissonance and the sense that the modern media landscape has become a very, very complicated space.
But maybe let's because you mentioned the acceleration of technology and the integration with neurobiology and AI. But so why is that worrisome?
Well, I think fundamentally, if we have a culture that is constructed on principles which could be seen as psychopathic or at least sociopathic, or definitely out of step with the parameters of the biosphere or the way ecology works.
Like an unlimited growth system in a limited planet.
Exactly. So it also incentivized by these dynamics whereby it's all about supposedly survival of the fittest and competitive dynamics.
And maximizing shareholders' values.
Exactly. So, and again, that's informed, I believe, by a whole sort of value system and a belief system. And if we sort of pull back even further from that, ultimately, I'd say it is this sort of metaphysical, philosophical, spiritual notion of what consciousness is. So if you look at any phenomenon from the position that you believe consciousness is something peculiar to the interior of your skull, then you'll come to certain conclusions. If you look at the same phenomena with a deeply intuitive acknowledgement that consciousness is something that you're within, then you can end up with some very different conclusions.
Yeah.
And so if we have AI that is developed and programmed by a culture that is incentivized by psychopathic values, then inevitably we will create an AI that is the product or manifestation of this sort of psychopathic system. So if we were to actually sort our shit out, as it were, and then develop an AI, I'm not saying that AI is inherently bad, but it's inevitable at the moment, I would say, that the AI is being developed by people who really shouldn't be doing what they're doing, and they know that, and they lots of them have called for a stop to it, but the Pandora's box is open, I think, and it's very, very worrisome.
Yeah, it's like a magnified lenses. But so we're going to go into why we got here in the second chapter, right?
Yes.
So just to finish on the context, one, it's the situation with AI and technology which might amplify a corrupt value system. Two, you were saying the cognitive dissonance. So can you talk a little bit about it? What does it mean?
Well, I think what's being pointed to there is people failing to make sense of what's going on. So I don't like this phrase sense making very much, but I think making sense of sense making is absolutely critical. And if we can't get to a reasonably informed position about the trajectory we are on, then we can't make informed decisions about the trajectory we want to get onto.
Yeah.
So we can't do anything differently until we start to think differently. And I think and I've been involved, as we all have, I think, in probably sort of deep, quite passionate discussions about what's going on in the world over the last few years. And I've often come out of those discussions to see that actually people who might appear to be at loggerheads with each other are just looking at the same thing, coming to perfectly valid conclusions, but they're just looking at these phenomena through different lenses, whether that's an esoteric sort of a lens or a deeply philosophical lens or a scientific lens that is couched in this mainstream materialistic reductionist view of the world. So the irony is that, as Niels Bohr, the physicist, I think, said, the opposite of one great truth is often another great truth. And with the sort of algorithmic enhancement of the sort of media landscape, we've got into this atomized place where nobody is able to sort of work. People find it very, very hard to recognize what's going on. And
What's true?
Well, and even that gets sort of quite muddy, doesn't it? I think we can sort of get bogged down in the granular detail about things, but what I'm really interested in the book is not to get stuck into all of that, but more to paint a kind of picture of the trajectory that we're on, because I think we can get bogged down in the nitty gritty, but I think we can probably all start to see that regardless of what we think is causing it or what's behind it or what is driving it, that there is a trajectory that we're on that is a sort of confluence of these exponential technologies and an economic and political paradigm that is redundant or obsolete or not fit for purpose, but is now being sort of optimized into this sort of dystopic digital sort of dictatorship, a sort of technocratic tyranny. And there's a sort of inexorable sort of momentum within those systems. So
technocratic tyranny because the censorship because it's not there's not a real true access to media.
Yes, and so because the digital landscape works in ones and zeros and in a binary polarized kind of way.
Yes.
And yes, some things are binary, but most things aren't.
Yes.
And well, lots of things aren't. And lots of things that can't be understood in a binary way are being reduced into a binary dialectic.
Yeah. And that's also because the binary approach to sense making, polarizing people, attract eyeballs.
Exactly.
And advertisers.
Exactly. And obviously, historically, it's been a very effective way at managing and controlling populations. And even the sort of infiltration, say, of
but why the polarization?
Well, divide and rule.
Divide and conquer, yeah.
Yeah. So it's, and even there's a lot of accounts now of how the sort of alternative media landscape gets disrupted by the infiltration of people or forces that are clearly there designed to keep people stuck in these little kind of whirlpools arguing with each other, rather than actually making any progress towards a
common
progressive solution. Exactly. Yeah. So I think I think what has to be recognised is there's an inherent energy and momentum within the ideologies, politically and philosophically, but there's also inherent energy in the technology itself, which is moving so fast and is far outstripping our ability to keep up with it in the kind of evolutionary and political sort of social sense. And that is essentially sort of taking us to a potentially very dangerous place. And I mean, one of the great books about sort of the collapse of what's called the collapse of complex societies, I think, by Professor Joseph Tainter in the mid-1970s. And he really did a huge study. It influenced Jared Diamond's book about collapse, and it came a bit later. And he comes to this conclusion towards the end of the book, having studied everybody from the Sumerians to the Mayans to the Romans to British colonialism, that the collapse of these complex societies is always preceded by an accelerated cultural homogenization in conjunction with rapid polarization.
Interesting.
And I think we see that going on at the moment. And the technologies and the way that they're being applied are just enhancing and accentuating that process.
Yeah. So just to stay on our schedule, AI and biology, cognitive dissonance. Then what are the other problems in terms of the context? The loss of biodiversity is a big one.
Well, I think those are sort of end of pipe manifestations of this sort of ideological sort of corruption, which I suppose gets deconstructed in the second part. So the first part, which is probably be shorter than the following two parts, is really just trying to kind of paint a picture, to recognise the factors behind what people call this meta crisis, and try and explain some of these terms that have been sort of trotted out a great deal, like cognitive dissonance, and really just sort of tee up some kind of a sort of critical thinking kind of lens through which to then approach the next stage of the book, where we really at the sort of ideologies that have basically come together to bring us to where we are now.
Yes. But so, just to be more specific about the meta-crisis, what are the different points of the meta-crisis? You mentioned technology, you mentioned cognitive dissonance, then what else?
Well, I suppose, my professional interest for 25 years has really been around the ecological crisis, and that in turn, through the sort of research and writing books and campaigning and the rest of it, ultimately took me upstream to the point, well, why is there an ecological crisis in the first place? And in a way that takes you to the sort of economic system, but then you have to sort of peel that back even further, and I think it then takes you to to this much more kind of profound sort of metaphysical question. And so the crisis now is not just an ecological crisis, it's a technological crisis, it's a spiritual crisis, it's an everything crisis, because the dynamics that underpin all of those systems are essentially linear and not cyclical, and nothing in nature is linear.
Yeah.
And so it's trying to sort of pull the veil off all of those things, whether it's a linear extractive economy or the limitations of reductionist science, in full recognition that all of these things have given us tremendous insights. And so it's important we don't throw everything out. And I think this gets particularly kind of pertinent when we look at something like the modern medical science area, where, of course, people are saved every second of every day by antibiotics and the miraculous intervention of modern medicine. But I think it's also important to recognize that when we're dealing with chronic systemic issues, be it cancer or autoimmune diseases or what, then we're woefully ill-equipped through the pharmaceutical armory to deal with those things. And so we need to kind of have a kind of much more of a wider understanding of what's appropriate in what context.
Okay, forgive me, Rory, because, our listener needs to be a little bit more, educated on, and I know the example of the health industry and the reductionist approach, and that is a very good explanation of why we got in the pickle we are today. But just to stay a little bit longer on why do we think we have a problem? Because, when you hear Steven Pinker or you hear, what's the name of the singularity guy, they seems to believe that we never been better, right? So I agree with you that there is, the fabric of society is crumbling. I've been 25 years in New York, and when you see these riots in the street, the Black Lives Matter and Oregon and New York, and to be honest with you, I wasn't that surprised, because I see to what extent the inequality that this system has brought has really put so much pressure on people that need to work 3 jobs to make ends meet, and the mortgage and the debt. And in the 50s in America, people had there was a big middle class. People could have 1 job in the family. The wife was at home. There was a dignity. There was time for the barbecue with the neighbors. And then now, the inequality really has grown so much. So, just spend another 2 minutes, if you can, on part 1, which is, why do we believe there is a problem? Because of loss of biodiversity, because inequality, because people are suffering, because people are unhappy, because we are losing the topsoil, because we believe that maybe we have, someone said 60 harvests left. Zach Bush says that we have 60 harvests left before the depletion of the topsoil is irreversible. Just spend a couple of minutes why like the, how they say, the 10,000 miles view on this planet, why this planet is in crisis.
Well, I suppose all of the things you just mentioned, the mental health epidemic.
The mental health.
I'd say is a particularly pertinent one.
Suicide, teenager suicide.
I mean, these are just sort of horrifying statistics, and these are all just symptoms of a deeply sick society, I'd say. J. Krishnamurti always said to be well adjusted to a sick society is no indicator of health. And so things are... Look, the technologists will always believe in the positive benefits of technology. And I think that there are interesting discussions to be had around that, which I want to delve into in the book too, that technology isn't fundamentally neutral. And I think, we're often sort of told, or we often lap that up. Of course, technology is neutral. It just depends how you use it. But no, it's not. Daniel Schmachtenberger refers to Ken Wilber's book, Sex, Ecology and Spirituality, where he does a bit of a deep dive into this area and highlights the fact that the advent of the plough changed our sort of ontology, our perception of who we were in relation to the universe. So the cow that was previously worshipped within an animistic kind of relationship, once it was tethered and whipped to pull and yoked to pull a plough up and down the field through the domestication of plants and animals and the advent of the agricultural revolution, then also our worldview, our sort of ontology had to shift to accept that. So the animistic connection with that animal
was lost.
And I think that's a really interesting example. So the notion that all of these technologies are fundamentally neutral, I think, is very, very disputable. There are plenty of... There's a lot to unpack there. And I think it's really hard at times. Yeah, we're never going to have a utopia. We're never going to have... that we live in a sort of dualistic universe. But at the moment, it's hard to see how the confluence of these factors is ever going to take us to anything other than a rather dark place, because it's not. And I think there's also an awful lot of people who are deeply immersed at the top of this kind of hierarchy who really genuinely believe in a sort of post-biological future. They genuinely don't think that biology is necessary, and I think they also believe that immortality is in their grasp. You read some of these claims coming out now that people think that really within a decade or so the people at the top of this pile will have access to technologies which really does sort of lead to massive life extension.
And why is that a problem, you think?
Well, I don't think that it's not inherently a problem in itself, but the chances of us seeing those technologies being democratized or be delivered to the people en masse is hard to envisage. This is going to stay rarefied in elitist kind of circles.
So more and more disequality and access to...
Exactly. So, I mean, where this logically goes is the absence of a middle class entirely, and a sort of what people call the sort of techno-overlord elite at the top of the pyramid, and then it's almost like a sort of neo-serfdom where the rest of the populations are really kind of so controlled and so enslaved through this combination of programmable money, central bank digital currency, social credit, digital ID, vaccination schedules, yada, yada, yada. So, and again, I think this is one thing I want to sort of to go into in the book, is that there is as a kid, I remember thinking that it was only logical that ultimately we would progress towards kind of a one world system. It seemed just like the inexorable, inevitable, progression. And
what do you mean one world? Like no frontier?
So yes, so exactly that the notion that so there's this big attack on sovereignty at the moment, not just sort of our own individual sovereignty, but sort of national sovereignty. And I think to truly try and understand some of the sort of cultural drivers at the moment, we have to look at this notion of what's called ideological subversion. And there are all sorts of strange things going on, which can be traced back decades and have been sort of exposed through all sorts of researchers and investigative journalists and the rest of it.
How do you call it? Ideological?
Ideological subversion. And it was a term that really kind of crept in through sort of KGB defectors like Yuri Bezmenov in the 60s, 70s. And the ultimate roots of this supposedly go back to Lenin and Lenin's notions of how communism could challenge the West and take over the world. That it couldn't do it militarily, so it had to do it by infiltrating and subverting the ideological pillars of its opponents.
But so this is a welcome movement, the ideological subversion movement?
Well, no, not at all, because it's often compressed into, say, a 20-year period, and that's how Bezmenov represented it, and then others since have validated this, other KGB defectors, but other... there's a book in the 80s that was really sort of deconstructing the whole sort of EU project. And if you condense it into, a 20-year period, the first 15 years is a demoralization process. So it's trying to demoralize a society through the infiltration of the sort of key pillars of the society and creating sort of disruptive kind of influence. this is then followed by a sort of 3-year destabilization period, which you could see the last 3 years as being that sort of destabilization, followed by a year or two of sort of chaos, really, where things really start to fall apart, with a view to then this final fourth phase where the solutions are presented. And by that stage, the society is so torn apart and so atomized and so polarized, and things are in such a mess that the majority of people will turn to anything that gives them some sort of new level of structure and order. And so that's the kind of 4-stage process that this notion is supposed to deliver.
So this is the technocratic overlord agenda, if you want.
Well, I suppose that's an aspect of it. And again, I think this is what gets really complicated, because we're so educated into the notion of the nation state and the sort of battles of the superpowers that our generation have sort of grown up in. But what I've begun to understand over the last 3 years, and of course this is way more complicated and complex than we ever imagined, and that there's been very active collaboration in these sort of deep state sort of zones between, say, America and China, that started with Kissinger meeting with Mao in the early 70s and then was perpetuated by Brzezinski in the 70s, who laid the foundations for some of these sort of technology transfers and the rest of it. And it was Kissinger's idea to really try and separate China and Russia, put America sort of into a sort of a new position between these other superpowers. So Brzezinski's openly stated aim was to drive everything towards the imposition of one global technocratic state.
Okay, so I think we're like already moved in part 2, which is the cause. So just to summarize, part 1, the context, we have a dire situation, according to Rory, because there's a mental health epidemic, there is a growing inequality, there is a loss of biodiversity, there is an ecological problem that it's under everybody's eyes, there is really a generation of young kids that are a little bit disenfranchised by the current system. We don't know what to trust now from the media, from the politician. So we are in a dire situation. So you already started to try to explain why did we get here. You said that's a process that started maybe 200 years ago. So let's go into the how did we get here part, which is part 2.
Great. Yes, and I think we can people go back tens of thousands of years to the agricultural revolution, or our transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers, as you well know through the work we did with Bruce. But that's a massive arc to undertake. So I plan to start around sort of 1850, 2 years after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. And I think Darwin's work is a fantastic example of how science can get co-opted or diluted or by a political and economic agenda. So if you run Darwin's collected works through a word search, you'll find references to cooperation and collaboration in nature more than references to competition. But of course, the competitive element of Darwinian thinking was very handy for the sort of colonialist, imperialist, expansionist economics of the mid-19th century, which was facilitated by the Industrial Revolution. So suddenly the advent of fossil fuels massively expanded our reach, population started going crazy. And we had an economic system that was sort of embedded in the notion of infinite resource abundance, masses of labor. And it obviously served a lot of people very, very well. And I suppose you could arguably say that sort of peaked in the 50s with the sort of age of affluence in the US particularly and the West. But so this term scientism, which has been sort of popularized in the last few years, I think is a very handy word to make this distinction between genuine science and the science that's being co-opted by a political agenda. So we start by looking at Darwinism, imperialism, and the foundations of scientism, and which had really sort of been evolving for hundreds of years already, particularly since the Enlightenment. But essentially this reductionist way of looking at the world, i.e. that the way to understand how things work is to take them apart to their smallest possible components. Now, of course, this gives us incredible insights, and I'm not disputing that for 1 second. But anything that doesn't fit in that lens or cannot be quantified empirically through that lens is considered to be worthless. So all phenomena, whether it's the sense of love and compassion that people feel between each other, or a whole host of anomalous or psychic phenomena, that this paradigm just simply won't take a look at. And it's now got to a very dangerous place because this sort of scientific priesthood, and again we'll sort of then look at that. Edward Bernays, who was, I think, Freud's nephew, and he was credited with sort of kickstarting the PR industry or public relations industry.
Marketing, yeah.
So, which was essentially, basically turning the word propaganda into something that was sort of much more palatable. And then the rise of sort of all of these sort of behavioral sort of sciences and our understanding of human psychology. So I think I was listening to somebody yesterday how so-called sort of subliminal advertising was meant to have been made illegal back in, I can't remember, it was in the 80s or something like that. But there's no doubt that subliminal advertising, subliminal sort of social engineering stuff is very much at work, and this is all very much in the public domain. I mean, you only have to look at some of these nudge units in the UK, and it's really, the UK government published a paper in 2012, I think, called Mindspace, which you can go and read online, where they openly brag about the ability to affect and impact the opinions and views of entire populations without people realizing it's happening.
Yeah, with the algorithm of social media and gently recognizing the people that are at risk of extreme views, target them and slowly feed them material that would increase and exacerbate their views.
Exactly. So I think when having sort of charted that a bit of that landscape around the sort of scientism paradigm, I've also, and the advent of the PR industry, and then the conjunction of that with sort of mass media. And so something like Project Mockingbird, which was this CIA program, I think it started in the late 40s or certainly in the 50s, and basically became the subject, I think, of congressional hearings in the early 70s.
Do you want to mention what it was?
Well, it was they basically admitted in the U.S. Senate, senior, I think, I can't remember if it was Alan Dulles then or what it was called, Cosby, but he had to admit to the U.S. Senate, yes, we've got something like 500 to 800 senior CIA operatives in senior positions within the U.S. media, and that the stated aim of Project Mockingbird was that when every American is so totally confused about what's going on, our mission will be complete. Now you could sort of expand that to incorporate the entire globe now. So I think part of the stagnation and inertia that's going on at the moment is we're finding it very difficult to work out what the way forward is because we don't really know where we are. And we're in this sort of untethered space where everything has been very disrupted and destabilized over the last few years. And we could, it doesn't matter whether that's been intentional or not. But people are lost. People are, in a difficult place trying to work out what's going on and trying to work out what the best thing to do is. And within that, you have this sort of weaponization of the ecological crisis, which again is creating tremendous dissonance and polarization. So lots of commentators or investigative journalists, researchers who I might agree with on a whole raft of things, I don't agree with necessarily on other things. I totally accept that the climate change issue has been massively weaponized, and there's all sorts of evidence to support that's just ramping up. But I think the notion that of dismissing the ecological crisis in its entirety is woefully naive. We just have to look at what's going on in the world's oceans, which are just so acidified by the excess carbon. And it is a pollution issue. We are the only species to have created waste because of our linear systems. And so climate change is an extension of that. Now, we could argue till the end of time about how much of that is anthropogenic, how much of that is due to humans' fossil fuel use. But it's never going to take us very far because we'll never get to the hub of that. And yes, I can accept that there is evidence that other planets in the solar system are also heating at the same time, that there are massive cosmological, geophysical factors here, massive sort of natural variations within changes the constant of the universe. But the notion that we can take what nature has spent 1 million years secreting into the Earth's crust and in 1 year stick all of that up in the sky and not expect there to be some repercussions seems really, really naive. Yeah. Now, accept that CO2 is necessary for photosynthesis, but the fundamental fact is we're not supposed to be taking it out of the ground at this kind of speed and sticking it up in the atmosphere, because natural geophysical timescales do not work on those principles. So our amplified existence and our amplified, and fossil fuels have allowed us to have this amplified existence.
But so, okay, it seems to me that the heart of what you think is the problem, the cause to this current state of affair is this approach that we have to have linear solution to complex problem. So I interrupted earlier when you were talking about the health system, but maybe we can go back there and use the way we address cancer and autoimmune disease, for example, to explain our audience what does it mean linear solution, why it's not really working out, and maybe give some example.
Yeah, so I think the original quote is something like, for every complex problem there is an answer that is clear, simple and wrong. And so I think that and that really goes, I think, to the nub of it. And so, funny enough, when I wrote my second book, Rising Tides, which was published in 2002, and it was a history of ecological thought and this how would we manage to separate ourselves from the natural world, at least conceptually? Ultimately, how can we be separate? But we have conceptually separated ourselves. And my ex-wife was from Barbados. We were living in Barbados, awaiting the birth of our second son, Dan. And I started working with a UK scientist called Dr. Colin Hudson, who was a soil physicist. He'd gone to Barbados in the late 40s and stayed ever since. And he was a remarkable man, and he had copies of The Ecologist magazine going back to issue 1, which I think was 1970 or something. And I sat down and I read every issue of The Ecologist from 1970 to 2001 or something. And he wanted to give me a T-shirt, said, I've read every issue of The Ecologist and survived. And one of the great revelations of that research for me was understanding the origins of the pharmaceutical industry and the limitations of it and the way that had all arisen. And I'd never really appreciated until then that pharmaceutical industry was a product of the oil industry, or the hydrocarbon industry. So that very clever Rockefeller who started Eastern Oil, or Standard Oil, and was he John D. Rockefeller? Anyway, he was obviously a very, very astute guy, because in conjunction with this explosion of the petroleum industry or petrochemical industry and the advent of creating synthetic drugs, at the same time you had Louis Pasteur developing germ theory, which, of course, he retracted on his deathbed, but nobody really knows that. And And then we could argue till the end of time again about germ theory versus terrain theory, and I don't think it's altogether one or other. There's clearly germ theory is valid in some cases, but we have applied it to a whole raft of pathogens and supposed transmission, which between people, which doesn't really seem to be validated by the science. And I find it fascinating now that even quite mainstream virologists who spent their entire lives rising to the top of their profession, some of them are really starting to question the existence of viruses altogether, or at least the notion that lots of things that have been ascribed to viruses really ought to be scrutinized. And we now know that things like asymptomatic transmission were a complete fabrication. And I was just listening last night to Dr. Rainer Fjormik, the German lawyer who's really been sort of unpacking all of this, and who famously took Deutsche Bank and VW to task. And he was pointing out that in September 2020, the CDC actually put out a paper underneath the radar just when nobody was really paying any attention, admitting that the PCR test could never be used in asymptomatic cases, and effectively discrediting the whole notion of asymptomatic transmission, upon which the entire global lockdown policy had been based. So essentially, there's a fantastic example of how flawed science has been used to support a political agenda, and very, very sort of tactical, clever releases of information at the right time. And this is how that this game is played. And it's really, really very fascinating.
Okay. Explain a little bit what is the terrain theory versus the germ theory.
Okay, so germ theory is essentially that the disease is carried by pathogenic vectors, whether it's a virus, a bacteria, or parasite, essentially. And terrain theory ultimately turns out on its head that actually what dictates what happens when that pathogen interacts with an organism is dependent upon the terrain in which that pathogen lands.
The body.
Yeah, exactly. So in the case of the human body, if the body is massively compromised, the immune system is massively compromised, the pathogen will take hold. And this, why is it that people cohabiting, one person goes down with something, the other person doesn't? And so what the terrain theory is suggesting is that ultimately it's all about the state of health of the organism. So this ecological term homeostasis, which is the perfect balanced conditions that life requires to thrive. And that's a fundamental part of Jim Lovelock's Gaia thesis. So all of these self-regulating mechanisms within the biosphere that have created a stable atmosphere and the rest of it for us to thrive in, if those get disrupted by all sorts of destabilizing factors, then things go awry. Similarly, there are lots of naturopaths now and an awful lot of science to support it, that if the acid-alkaline balance of the body is optimized at, I think it's 7.4 to 7.6, then this homeostasis is there and the pathogens cannot take hold. And but most of us live in a deeply acidified environment. Very acidic diet is even evidence that sort of negative toxic thoughts are acidifying. All of the pollutants, most intoxicants. I think it's pretty impossible to have a sort of perfect acid-alkaline balance and still have alcohol in your diet, for instance. So I don't think it really, those things can really coexist. So I think but at the same time, when people talk about the fact that no viruses get isolated and purified, you can't actually, nobody can actually produce any evidence of here's SARS-CoV-2. What they can produce is a sort of genomic sequence, which is really a sort of a pattern, but there's no thing there that is it. Whereas something like I think, the herpes simplex virus, I think, has been isolated and purified. And it's quite clear that there is that germ theory does work, seems to work. And maybe in most cases, it's a bit of both. And again, it's not this sort of black and white thing, but the notion that it's all about the germ was very useful to support the pharmaceutical industry's rollout. And so you can then, lots of researchers have deconstructed this. So over the last 150 years or so, this kind of Rockefeller medicine paradigm has gradually diminished or outlawed all naturopathic medicine. So there was the Flexner report, I think, that was published with the Rockefellers and Carnegies in, I think, 1913, that effectively kind of institutionalized this particular medical paradigm. You can then see how this then infiltrated all of the medical schools across the US and then sort of around the wider world. And so you've got this sort of completely kind of interlocked industry that is determining what is taught in medical school, is supported by a raft of pharmaceutical drugs, and is also at the same time doing everything possible to diminish or subvert or criticize healing modalities that have been around for millennia and were obviously efficacious. Now, I recognize I've got friends whose kids with ADHD have been recorrected by Ritalin. I've got a dear friend with Parkinson's who's leading a normal life now because of the drugs and the rest of it. I'm not saying that all of this is bad, but what I am saying is that when it comes to a lot of chronic issues that we're currently dealing with, the cancer epidemic, mental health issues, autoimmune issues, generally what all that pharmaceuticals are doing is dealing with the symptoms rather than the causes. And if we really wanted to address the root causes of these things, we have to look a lot deeper and we have to go upstream and into a much more sort of preventative space. So by optimizing our immune systems, so that the biggest organ in the body, some people say, is what's called the interstitial fluid. So the liquid in your body, between all the different organs of the body, if that's acidified, you're going to have a compromised immune system, and therefore the external pathogens are going to have a greater likelihood of creating disease.
Yes. Okay. So this, the health example, it's very clear. For me, the most obvious thing is this serotonin inhibitor, this SSRI for depression. Intuitively, of course, not a doctor, but I can see how a medicine that artificially, inhibits the synapses from the serotonin to stay. Basically, this idea that, okay, what's create well-being and happiness is serotonin in the brain, so we're gonna just inhibit the synapses so the serotonin can keep bathing the brain, and so we're gonna address depression like that. It's obviously a shortcut which doesn't seem to be sustainable, and as a matter of fact, it creates a lot of side effects, like people put on weight and they feel sedated, they lost the libido. It's even if sometimes, of course, in suicidal case, it's better than nothing. But if I can try to summarize the part two, which is the cause, basically in a global model of neoliberal capitalism where the system is driven by commerce and profit, it is very easy for interest groups to weaponize politics, health, environment, ecology into something which not necessarily address the well-being of the population. So, am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I think the one of the other things that I think is important within this whole discussion, and which again I'll dig into in this part of the book, is that we're really so conditioned into the belief that we need centralized, state-controlled infrastructure and institutions. Now, I don't necessarily advocate that all of these institutions and systems need to go. Most of them are so inherently corrupted that they're no longer fit for purpose. But the reason why we are so disempowered and are continuing to lose our sovereignty is because we've abdicated our control over our essential needs to all of these disembodied, centralized systems. So what we see unfolding now and through Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and this kind of response to the ecological crisis, or the way it's being sold to us, of course, is the extension or logical continuation of this flawed political and economic paradigm. And it is actually ultimately about, ultimate centralization. So every single asset on the planet becomes digitized. And if you're not prepared to sign up to the dictates of this system, you simply don't get a look in. Some of what's coming out now is possibly you won't even be able to get online or have a bank account or insure your car unless you conform to all of these dictates, and with programmable money in the equation. Now, the opposite of that, of course, is decentralization and distributed networks. And so the notion of these genuinely decentralized peer-to-peer platforms are absolute anathema to the technocrats, because they operate entirely independently and entirely parallel to these conventional mainstream systems, and are very, very basically impossible to control or manipulate or interfere with. And so this is genuinely very threatening. And I think it's interesting to note that two of the characters who get sort of trotted out a lot in recent years are Aldous Huxley and George Orwell, for obvious reasons. Huxley's Brave New World in 1936, which kind of sort of predicts the whole sort of biotechnology revolution and social engineering and all of this stuff, and 1984, which I think was published in 1948. But I only recently realised that Orwell, Huxley wrote his riposte to Brave New World in his final novel Island, where he creates this fictional utopia called Parlour, and there's the administration of this moksha medicine, which is a sort of psychedelic sacrament that is used judiciously to sort of keep society stable. But Orwell said that that 1984 was the logical endgame of the rollout of this kind of this trajectory, and the only way out of that was this totally decentralized grassroots bottom-up kind of shift. So this is really the nub of the problem, I think, because you cannot incrementally optimize or shift these current institutions and systems into the decentralized distributed networks that we want to create.
With blockchain.
Exactly. So blockchain could be used in a centralized way as well as in a decentralized way. And so I think what's difficult at the moment, or part of the dissonance and problem we have grappling with all of this, is that sadly, I think, and I came to this conclusion 20 years ago with writing Rising Tides, that the only way these parallel systems can actually take hold, it is almost dependent upon the collapse of the prevailing one. And this takes us back to sort of Buckminster Fuller's famous quote, you can't create change by fighting the existing reality. You have to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And so these new models, whether it's regenerative agriculture, preventative biological medicine, real sort of these decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, the really kind of cutting edge, I think, of the blockchain sort of crypto space. All of these systems share some common principles in the sense that they are operating in this much more sort of interconnected, systemic, holistic way. And they're coming from the bottom up. And again, a lovely quote I came across yesterday from Marshall McLuhan that builds on Buckminster Fuller's Operation Manual for Spaceship Earth. And I suppose in a way what I'm attempting to do with this book is a sort of a contemporary version of that. What if we are to have a genuinely regenerative culture and society, what are the parameters that we would have to conform to for that to happen? And those are the principles I really, really want to highlight. But McLuhan said, there are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We're all crew. And again, what I would love to achieve through this book is to help people come out of what I see as this kind of 5 cycles of grief process, where the sort of existential crisis and the meta crisis is creating what's normally associated with the grieving process with the loss of a loved one: anger, denial, anger, bargaining, despair, acceptance, something like that. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross.
Interesting.
And that the grieving process takes you through those 5 stages, and it doesn't necessarily go sequentially. You can bounce from anger and despair and back to denial to a level of acceptance, and then it all starts again. And I think collectively as a species, we're in this, our mutual friend Daniel Pitchbeck coined this term, the planetary initiation, which I think is a really useful term at the moment. And it is, and Charles Eisenstein talks about us moving into adulthood as a species. But I think this gerbil wheel of these 5 cycles, what I want to try and do is show some way of getting out of that spiral and into a point of mobilization, of recognizing that there isn't any kind of external force or savior that's, Donald Trump isn't going to save us, nor is the second. It's going to come from us. And it's a very difficult point for a lot of people to get to because it's momentous. But Bill Bollinson, the founder of permaculture, said, the reason I'm regarded as so seditious is because it's very threatening to these centralized structures to have people who've got control over their resources, because then you have no way of controlling them. And so that level of self-reliance and empowerment at a grassroots community level is the most threatening thing and the most powerful thing that we can do. So if the communities that have the maximum control over their food, water, energy, communications, housing, these fundamental things that are important for our society to function. The communities that have the most control over those things are the communities that I believe have the greatest chance of emerging out of this period we're in now. And as these centralized infrastructure and systems fail, the things that will work will be the things that people turn to. So I think I don't want to diminish the importance of people taking to the streets and the rest of it, but quite often, if you look at the amount of energy that's gone into kind of combating the prevailing paradigm, if that energy was redirected into actually constructing and building the new paradigm that is necessary, then we can see, I hope, a sort of critical mass of people jumping ship. Because at the moment, all of these parallel systems have been discarded as, that doesn't work. Organic agriculture is not economic. Well, it's not economic when seen through the lens of the current economic system. But as we know, every 10 units of energy expended in industrial agriculture only produces 1 unit of energy of food. So it's woefully inefficient and actually only produces 30% of the food in the global marketplace. So like 65-70% of the food consumed in the world is still produced by rural peasant farmers. But these are all the things that we're not taught about. And I suppose one of the most important books for me in recent years was a book by a British academic called Chris Smage, Smage, called A Small Farm Future. And he really very compellingly shows that given the current population and what's being envisioned by the sort of industrial agriculturalists, there is simply no way that you can feed the global population with industrial agriculture without completely destroying the planet. And that is self-evident. And the only way, if there is a way to get out of this, it is through the replacement of industrial agriculture with networks of small and medium-scale diversified farms, employing local communities, supplying local markets. And here you have, the most systemic solution available to us. You recorrect the mental health epidemic by bringing people back to the land, and serotonin and dopamine, which we were talking about earlier, thrive in living organic topsoil. So
nutrients, food.
Well, these neuromodulators that control our emotional moods, that are also produced in the gut, they're also there in the soil.
Yeah.
And so healthy soil produces healthy food, which produces a healthy microbiome, which produces a healthy mind and healthy psychology. So it really does come literally from the grassroots up. And then likewise, you then strengthen and build local food economies. You create a whole load of community consolidating dynamics. You also then recorrect the carbon cycle. And so some people suggest that you only need to raise the average organic soil content of a tiny percentage of the global agricultural land by about 1% to bring carbon back to pre-industrial levels. So I think this whole issue around soil carbon is fundamental. And the notion that, so again, look at the lies we've been told about sort of veganism and meat and the rest of it, all sorts of dietary and nutritional guidelines. Now, the methane that's coming out of farting or it's actually burping cattle, is because they're being fed on grain, which they're not supposed to eat, which again has been grown on decimated rainforest in the Amazon. Now, if you feed cattle on grass that they're supposed to eat, and you reduce the methane emissions by 99%, and I think if you add seaweeds into their feed or something, you actually completely eradicate the methane emissions altogether. And at the same time, you rebuild the topsoil, and you basically have a kind of animal husbandry system within the agricultural system that's fundamental to keeping the whole thing going.
Yes, fascinating. So let me see if I can try to recap a little bit. So part one of the book explain the current state of affairs, which is a planet basically choked by corruption. Part two, the cause of the corruption, it's simply that a minority of people were able and are able to manipulate the system to maximize their interest at the expenses of a lot of people. And part three, you explore this idea of we need a new paradigm that makes the old one obsolete. But so if corruption and greed is rooted on, it's part of, I can remember says that, we have both genes. We have the selfish genes and we have the altruistic genes. We came from a period of abundance in India 20,000 years ago with 50 type of mango. And so we developed the collaborative genes there, the altruistic gene. In the dry spell of Africa, in the moment of scarcity, we developed the selfish gene because the food was scarce, right? So we have both. And in the Navajo tale, the black wolf and the white wolf, what wins, the selfish gene or the altruistic genes? And, it's the one you feed. So I guess in part three, as you said, there's going to be practical solution like moving from an industrial agricultural world into a small farm world. But then there is also a badly needed change in consciousness. So what role do psychedelic and this explosion in self-inquiry, inner exploration, do you think this is enough to bring about the consciousness expansion that will create the awareness that we need to feed the white wolf to basically change this paradigm? How do you think that's what you're going to discuss in part three of the book, right?
Yes, no, for sure. So the regeneration platform has these 6 silos, starting with food, which is at the foundation of health, which is then sort of underpinning the sort of new economics ideology. And then the other 3 are community, culture, and consciousness. Now, ultimately, of course, consciousness could become at the beginning, but in a way, it's the one that's sort of most difficult for many people to grapple with. And again, going back to where we started slightly, if one looks at all of this through the lens and still from the belief that consciousness is peculiar to, is a product of neuronal firing in the brain, as opposed to seeing consciousness as the ground of all being, which all the mystical traditions have told us, and that we are just the human brain is just a sophisticated instrument through which that functions. Huxley famously talked about the transmitter as opposed to the receiver. So I would say the explosion of the interest in psychedelic medicine and self-inquiry and all of these sort of mystical traditions and the rest of it is, again, a manifestation or a symptom of the despair that people feel because all of the notions about what constitutes sort of wealth or success or progress that we've been sort of conditioned or educated to believe in, most sort of critical thinkers get to a point where recognizing that these are all deeply sort of skewed. And without redefining those key drivers, we're only ever going to keep repeating the same mistakes. And so how do we reprogram those drivers? And that's what Schmachtenberger calls the omni-win-win. So you have an alignment of interests between people, planet and profit, if you like, so that you've actually got a thriving biosphere, thriving economics, and a thriving society. I mean, this is the ultimate goal, obviously. So without a kind of deep sort of metaphysical, philosophical, spiritual shift in our understanding of who and what we are in relation to each other and the rest of the biosphere, then these other systems aren't ever really going to have the proper support that they require. So I think one of the fascinating areas around modern psychedelic research, they've coined this term, the default mode network, to describe these sort of anterior sections of the brain that seem to be correlating with the notion of the egoic entity. And that what happens in the mystical experience, in the psychedelic experience, is a suppression of the default mode network and massive kind of connectivity in the brain between the prefrontal lobes and the rest of it. So all sorts of things going on which normally don't happen. And again, Huxley used to refer to the reducing valve, that the brain is like a reducing valve because we simply it can't cope with the amount of information that's available to it from the sort of consciousness sphere at large. And what psychedelics do is sort of basically switch that off or suppress it. So there's then this sort of flood of new sensory information and new neuronal firing and new connections. And one of the great, most of the focus is, and I understand why, is around these compounds, is addressing things like addiction and mental health issues, and they're phenomenally efficacious for that. What's not acknowledged so much is this notion of what E.O. Wilson called biophilia, this term of this innate knowledge of our interconnection to the planet, and which is probably, in a way, arguably the most crucial thing of all. And so most people who've had a profound psychedelic experience, have a new appreciation of the interconnection with the natural world. And so I think they serve a phenomenal purpose. But again, they're not the sole answer in and of themselves. As Alan Watts said, these are things like a boat you use to cross the river. Once on the other side, the journey continues by foot. And so often similarly with sort of the meditative traditions, I've often the teaching, the technique, the body of thought, or the concepts that have been so powerful for one's spiritual journey can often over time become the very obstacle to the completion of the journey, because all that's happened is the replacement of one thing with and then the ultimate sort of revelation or the enlightenment or whatever one wants to call that is the absolute sort of dropping away of all of those concepts. And so I think we're at this fascinating time, and there is clearly an acceleration of going on in these things and in these areas. And I don't believe ultimately that the world is destined to be led into this sort of one world technocratic dystopia. I think we'll see parts of that manifesting around the globe, and we're seeing it now. But I think the chinks in the armour of all of that are becoming increasingly clear. And more people every day are recognising that things are being steered in a direction that's not necessarily what they want to subscribe to. But where we want to get to at the other side of all of this is probably not going to happen without a fairly kind of grisly process in between. And this is, if we apply the sort of chaos complexity theory dynamics to that, or what's called dissipative structures, as the sort of polarized elements of a system get stretched to the maximum point of elasticity, and then there's a jump, either a regression to a previous state or a transcendence into a new state. And let's all hope and pray that that's where it's going, because if it's a regression, then the future starts to look very dark indeed.
Yes, that's extremely clear. One thing I just wanted to add regarding, psychedelic use for, medical condition like anxiety, depression, addiction. It's the most used application of this compound, and you were saying that we don't have yet a fully understanding of the change of ontology that these compounds are bringing. But that, I just want to be optimistic about this, because, what they call the integration industry, there is now a new industry of sitter, of psychedelic sitter, of people sitting for people going through psychedelic experience. Some of them are becoming legal now. Australia has legalized mushroom and MDMA. MDMA should be legal next year in America, and then followed by magic mushrooms. So there is a lot of courses. You can see them on social media, on the internet, on people teaching people to, integrate their psychedelic experiences. But what is not completely there, which I think it's a good news because it means that it can grow, is to integrate the metaphysical aspect, the transcendental, this idea that, when you see an entity, a benevolent entity, and, the integration people today still don't go there. When in the school that I've been studying and following, when, people, the integration helps in addressing personal issue of blind spotty, of anxiety, of trigger, of childhood trauma. All that stuff is coming along quite nicely. But then the moment that someone brings in an entity from a different planet, then the integration specialist would say, oh, this is shamanism. You go and speak with the shaman, you go and speak with the priest. But so until we're going to have this dichotomy, I think that psychedelics are doing good, but for the potential to really change consciousness, there should be a new generation of integration specialists that develop a language that makes understand that they are different dimension, interdimensional being, that David Bohm called the implicate order, or Schulger called the morphogenetic field, Daniel Pinchbeck called it like pattern, or the Theosophist and Blavatsky would call it like the Akashic record, or the cosmic memory bank, and what the Eastern philosophy has been saying forever, this idea of different dimension. And when you have an understanding of that, then comes the mentality of there's no passenger on this planet, we are all crew. And with this understanding, then there will be a different approach to life, a different approach to society, to community, and then the white wolf could prevail.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot there. I talk about Ken Wilber a lot, and I'm sure many listeners are aware of his work, but if you're not, he was sort of the forefront of the transpersonal psychology movement, or like Stanislav Grof, who did a lot of the pioneering work with LSD and other psychedelics back in 50s and 60s. And But Wilbur started, he wrote his first book, I think, when he was sort of 20, 21, phenomenal intellect. And much of his work is quite dense and impenetrable. There is one book called No Boundary, which I always recommend to people as being very accessible and really a deeply transformative book, I think, for many people.
Who's the author of that? We're going to put
Ken Wilber.
We'll put on the show notes.
So, and Wilber, his second book, I think, was called The Spectrum of Consciousness, where he first started to outline, I think, these 9 different stages within the evolution of consciousness, starting from this sort of oceanic, Euroboric state. So Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, or the oceanic pre-egoic state of the infant before the ego has constellated itself, through a progression of different stages. And the final stage is this sort of transpersonal non-dual stage where I would like to believe we're headed. And we're sort of on the cusp of it now, and hence the rapid popularization of these non-dual teachings, through people like Eckhart Tolle and the rest of it. So, 20 years ago when I was first getting interested in these areas, very few people knew about those teachings. They now have proliferated and been popularized by Deepak Chopra and others. Now, I think the important thing that Wilber points out is that this transpersonal non-dual state has many characteristics that are similar to the oceanic state of the infant, but the important difference is it's been through this journey of all these other stages of consciousness to get there. And along that journey, each evolution is dependent upon the integration and transcendence of the previous stage. So I think when we look at the notion of the sage-like state or the dissolution of the ego, the egoic lens tends to project onto that and goes, oh, well, what the sage is like a sort of, as one of my teachers said, like an amorphous blob of tofu, that there is a complete absence of characteristic and personality, when of course that's not really the case. The personality, the conditioning remains. It's just the identification within the organism with the consciousness itself. And so the foreground goes into the background goes into the foreground is one way of looking at it. So I think I agree that this integration thing is crucial. I think it's also important. I was listening to Paul Levy yesterday, or a couple of days ago, the author of this phenomenal book, Wetiko, around the problem of evil and how that gets passed down generationally within cultures, and how we disrupt those patterns and sort of eradicate them to move into another. Absolutely fascinating stuff. And he was saying how his local bookstore near where he lives won't stock his books because they don't want, it's a spiritual bookshop, but they don't want to look at the dark stuff and the evil stuff. And it is all about, fluffy white bunny rabbits and, angels and the rest of it. Now, so I think, we have to look at the shadow. We have to look at the dark stuff. We have to, the ancient Taoist yin-yang symbol is so personal in so many cases at the moment. As the light grows stronger, the shadows grow longer and all of this. So the one thing is driving, the darkness is driving the light and in a way. So I think, but at the same time, we don't want, it's important, a lot of people don't want to look at the dark stuff for obvious reasons. I had to do a deep dive over the last 3 years to unpack a lot of this stuff, and I ended up in some extremely dark places and information that I probably I hadn't come across, but I kind of had to kind of get to a place within myself to reckon, okay, what I thought was going on is now sufficiently substantiated and validated by enough people, credible people who are at the top of their game, for me to feel sufficiently confident that I'm okay with this. But also recognizing what Nietzsche said, be careful about how long you stare into the abyss, because the abyss will stare back into you. So my work has always been about trying to kind of point towards the solution stuff and the positive stuff. But I also realized in the last few years that to really articulate the trajectory of where I think we need to go is also dependent upon a recognition of the trajectory we're on and the drivers behind that. And some of that is dark, and we can argue till the end of time about how much of that is extra dimensional, archonic energies, how much of that is sort of implicit sort of human nature, how much. Yeah. But again, I think it's much more useful to look at this through this ideological lens rather than trying to focus on a cabal of evil, dark people plotting nasty things behind closed doors. Now, that sort of thing has always happened through history. But there's a wonderful interview with Huxley and Mike Wallace, I think, from 1958, where he really kind of highlights this so beautifully. And he says, if you start to see these people as the ultimate sort of manifestations of this ideology rather than the authors or generators of it. So it's perfectly possible that some of these people, like the Gateses of this world, who's come from generations of eugenicists, is a confirmed technologist, doesn't really have any kind of ecological, biological thinking sensibilities, and may genuinely believe that what he's doing is entirely philanthropic and positive and in humanity's greatest interests, despite the fact that he's clearly responsible for the deaths and sterilization of hundreds of thousands of women in Africa and India and the rest of it, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I think, the value judgments that we ascribe from our sort of egoically identified position about this guy's really bad and evil, or this guy's that doesn't really take us anywhere.
Yeah.
But if we can see how these ideologies have conflated over a period of time, and the people who've risen to these positions of influence because they are the most psychopathic and sociopathic, and therefore capable, through their complete lack of empathy, have risen to these positions. And I'm not saying that every successful person in the world is a psychopath or a sociopath, but an awful lot of them appear to be. There was this famous study done by Forbes magazine that reckoned that at least 30% of the upper management of the Fortune 500 could be officially described as sociopathic or psychopathic. So there's no doubt that some of the most powerful people in the world at the moment exhibit some of those qualities. But they probably think that what they're doing is the right thing.
Very good. Very good. On that basis, we spent an hour and a half. You're going to set up a GoFundMe campaign. So for people that are interested on this book and want to help with donation, they can. We will put the GoFundMe link on the show notes. I will try to persuade Rory to have a very accessible selling price for this book. Maybe the digital version can be almost free.
Yes.
And then you can have some nice, paper edition or hardback edition.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which will be maybe a limited series. We'll think about it. We'll put all these books that you mentioned on the show notes. If people want to reach out with you, if they want, to collaborate or, interact with you, are you open? Do you you don't have a social media presence?
I don't at the moment. As you know, over the last 3 years, I sort of came off all of that, but I am about to sort of get back on it all. I've had sort of boring health issues and the rest of it, but I'm about to sort of re-engage with all of that. So at the moment, the best way to contact me is by email, and it's either Rory Spowers at protonmail.com or Rory Regen at pm. Actually, Rory Spowers at protonmail.com is the best one.
And we'll put it and we'll put it on the show notes. It was a pleasure to have you, Rory, and looking forward to the next one.
Thank you, Giancarlo, so much.
Thank you.
Koka sunarai sunarayante Koka sunarai sunarayanti. Koka sunarai sunarayanti. Koka sunarai sunarayanti. Koka sunarai sunarayanti. Koka sunarai sunarayanti.